Hey guys, we're going to talk about the plasma membrane today. This will finish out your cell notes. The plasma membrane is a membrane that goes around animal cells, and it is super important because its primary function is to protect the cell. There are a couple of ways that it does that. One is it keeps the cell's interior separate from the exterior, and so it enables the cell to maintain homeostasis on the interior. Secondly, it's determining what can go in and out. And so we say that that is selectively permeable. The model we're going to look at is called the fluid mosaic model. So the fluid part just refers to the plasma membrane being movable. It is not a rigid barrier at all, very fluid. The mosaic part means that there are many small pieces that make up the whole, just like a mosaic in art. Okay, so if you look at the picture here, you can see that there's a whole lot going on with this. In this picture, this would be like the outside environment, and this would be inside the cell. And each of these pieces is really important, and we'll talk about them kind of on a overarching view. So first of all, in order to be the doorman, like this little cartoon here, the cell has to know what's hitting it, and it has to allow some things in and keep some things out. The primary part of the plasma membrane is called a phospholipid bilayer. So the bilayer means there are two layers here. They are made of phospholipids, and they're oriented in this way specifically, where the heads are on the outside and the inside of the cell, and these little tails are on the interior of the plasma membrane. So if we're looking at the phospholipids specifically, we want to note that the head, or the ball, is a phosphate. It is polar, and we call it hydrophilic. And then the tails are the lipid part. The tails are non-polar, and we say that they're hydrophobic. So to give you some idea of context, if you remember back to chemistry, you talked a lot probably about water as a polar molecule because it had those two hydrogens on top that were positive and the oxygen on the bottom that was negative. Kind of looks like Mickey Mouse ears. And because it's more positive on the top and more negative on the bottom, we say it's a polar molecule. A non-polar example you probably talked about in chemistry is oil. Okay. And non-polar and polar things do not mix. Think about like if you've ever had a salad dressing, the oil and the water layers don't mix well at all. You can shake it up, but they separate very quickly. Okay, so the phospholipids are made in such a way that they are polar on the head end and non-polar on the tail end. And so that makes this membrane insoluble to water. It also prohibits things that are charged or very large from traveling through easily. Okay, so just to kind of sum it up, we've got hydrophilic on the outside. Hydrophilic literally means water loving. Okay, and so we've got water as a solution that can be on the outside and the inside of the cell. And then the interior is hydrophobic. And so hydrophobic means literally water fearing. In other words, water does not go through well at all. And so some things can go straight through this that are very small and non-charged, like oxygen. The oxygen molecule is very little, and so it can go in and out. Bigger things, charged things, and polar things like water cannot go through. If you have a hard time remembering, we've got a little comic here to try to help you remember. So we've got the hydrophilic on the outside and the inside of the cell. And then we've got hydrophobic on the interior of the membrane. And so if you've got a little phospholipid with a water gun here, that's going to create mass chaos, right? Those little tails do not like water, and they don't want it around. So the tails are on the inside of the membrane, and those are hydrophobic. Okay, so if all we can get through are things like carbon dioxide and oxygen, that presents a problem. We need to have more things going through the membrane, right? And so there are, in fact, more things in the membrane. This first one, protein molecules are actually in a variety of different ways in the membrane. The key way that you need to remember are in protein channels. So you can think of a protein channel as almost like a straw that goes all the way through the membrane. Okay, however, it's got a door on it, and that door will only open for certain ID cards, so to speak. So if you ate a cookie at lunch and your body is pulling glucose out of that, you need that glucose for your mitochondria to make ATP, right? It needs to be able to get into the cell somehow. Well, those molecules can go up to protein channels, and some protein channels will recognize those and allow them in. A random bacteria, though, can't get in because it doesn't have the right ID card. Okay, so protein molecules primarily are channels, and we'll learn more about that when we get to transport. Just know that they exist at this point, and then there are other proteins kind of embedded in the cell that have some other functions that we'll talk about in a few minutes when we get to cells that stick together. Our second molecule is super important. So cholesterol has a really bad rap. If you've ever seen a Cheerios commercial, then you know that it's presented as cholesterol is always bad. However, the reality is that your plasma membrane in all of your cells absolutely has to have cholesterol. It is a vital component because what it does, it allows the cell membrane to maintain the right level of fluidity. Okay, you don't want the cell membrane to be too fluid and begin to be leaky. You also don't want it to be rigid. We don't want our body cells to be like a plant cell that has that rigid wall around them. And so cholesterol sits kind of in between the plasma membranes, the phospholipids, and if they're getting too far apart, it can grab onto them and hold them together. If they're getting too rigid and packed together, it can separate them a little. So cholesterol is super cool in that it keeps the membrane at just the right level of fluidity. The third thing here are called glycoproteins. So this is a glycoprotein. Basically, it's a protein embedded that has a short chain of carbohydrates on it. Those glycoproteins do a couple of really important things. One is they enable each of your body cells to have its own ID card, basically. So your body knows which cells are liver cells and which cells are blood cells and which cells are muscle cells, because each of those cells have glycoproteins that say that it's you and what kind of cell it is. The second big thing that they do is they allow cells to communicate with each other. They are signaling different things. And so like if you get a virus that comes into your system, the virus has its own glycoproteins, its own ID card, and your cells can communicate with that and figure out that it's not supposed to be there, that it's foreign, it's a pathogen, needs to be destroyed. Okay? So super important. Glycoproteins, cholesterols, and protein molecules are embedded and going through the phospholipids, and all of that together is that mosaic that makes up your selectively permeable plasma membrane. Couple quick things to sum up before we move on. Cholesterol is not always a bad thing again. It can be bad. If it's building up in your arteries, then that is a bad thing. However, in the case of your plasma membrane, cholesterol is not bad. It's in fact very, very vital to your healthy plasma membrane. And then for cell interactions, you have them happening all over your body, all of the time, right? Your body is maintaining homeostasis and requires communication between cells for that to happen. But one that you might be easily able to think about are white blood cells are on the prowl for foreign things, pathogens. And so they are communicating with every cell they encounter to determine what it is and whether it's supposed to be there. So that is a cell-to-cell interaction, one of many, many, many that's happening in your body all the time. Okay, let's talk about some specializations that are on some plasma membranes. So one is called microvilli. microvilli basically are these little extensions. So it's the plasma membrane itself that is shaped like this, where it's this like wavy shape. And in doing that, it allows that cell to have an extremely large surface area. So cells that need to absorb a lot will have microvilli, and that enables those cells to have a very high cell surface to interior ratio. An example would be in your small intestine. If you are digesting your lunch right now, the food is getting broken down and nutrients need to be taken in. Well, your small intestine cells are covered in these microvilli so that they can absorb a huge volume of nutrients easily, because the surface itself is very large for the size of the cell. Okay, let's talk about how cells stick together. So you have a few cells in your body that are just on their own. Things like red blood cells, white blood cells, sperm, those kind of cells need to be extremely mobile, and so they're not generally connected to other cells. However, most of your cells do need to be connected. Imagine if your skin cells were all separate. You would not be waterproof. All kinds of stuff could be coming in and out of you. You'd be very leaky, and that's a problem. So cells are stuck together, and they're stuck together by their plasma membranes. There are 3 different ways in general that those membrane junctions happen. So we'll talk about all 3 of these, and we can come back and look at this picture again. But you've got tight junctions, you've got adhering junctions called desmosomes, and then you have what are called gap junctions. So first, tight junctions. These are where the cells are extremely tightly connected. The proteins in the plasma membrane will adhere to the proteins of the cell next to it, and so they are really tightly stuck together. Your skin is a good example of where this happens. Your inside of your gut cells, also inside of your stomach and your intestines. And that's super important because you want those cells to be tightly joined so that nothing comes out. Your stomach has hydrochloric acid inside of it, right? So your stomach cells have some adaptations that keep them safe from the hydrochloric acid, but the rest of your cells don't have that. So you don't want hydrochloric acid to get out of your stomach. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm coughing. Okay, so normal tight junctions in your stomach, the cells are really, really tightly connected. You can see those little microvilli for absorption and such. But in between the cells, we've got a very tight junction. Nothing's getting through. There's actually a disorder called leaky gut where the junction breaks, and so stuff can get through. It could cause pain and major issues, so that's not good. Okay, so that's an example of your tight junction. The second one are called adhering junctions. They function with something called desmosomes. So desmosomes are like buttons in buttonholes. So the cells are connected, but there is more flexibility to them. Think about like a button-up shirt that you might have. You can pull on the sides of the shirt and stretch where the buttons are connected, but they should stay together. So this is in a similar way where there's a connection, but there's a little more flexibility between cells. An example of where you might find this in the body is in the uterus. So for a woman who's pregnant, those uterine cells need to be able to stretch significantly, right, to hold that growing baby. They also need to be able to contract when it's time for baby to be born. And so the buttonhole connections allows the cells, the uterus itself, to be stretchy and to be flexible in the sense that it can contract and expand. Our third type of junction are called gap junctions. So gap junctions are pretty cool. They're like little channels in between cells. And so like you can see with the little black arrow here, things can go straight through those from cell to cell very easily. An example of this is in your heart cells. So your heart cells need to be able to contract together, right? It has to be synchronated. Otherwise, that's going to be a problem. You don't want part of your heart contracting at one point and part of it doing at a different point. The way that your heart contracts is through an electrical current. If you've had physics, it's just like a current that makes your light bulb turn on. You've got a current in your heart. And so you have some salts that can travel through these channels that allow the current to run. It can happen very, very quickly. And so your heart can beat together. All of those cells can communicate extremely rapidly. Okay, so those are your junctions. And then the last two things here are structures that would be on top of the cell membrane. These are, again, for specialized cells. They're not on every cell. One is cilia. So cilia is different than microvilli. Microvilli is a plasma membrane itself in that wavy pattern. Cilia are little hair-like structures on top of the plasma membrane, and they beat together for some sort of fluid aspect. So an example would be in your trachea. When you breathe in, oxygen can go by, but you have cilia on all of those cells that are constantly beating upwards. And so if you breathe in some dirt, some dust, some smoke, some pollen, those cilia help to remove that from your body because they're constantly beating upwards without you having to cough. So long-term smokers have that smoker's cough because all the gross stuff in cigarettes has killed off the cilia, and so they don't have that beating. So they have to actually cough in order to get anything out of their airway. The cool thing is if they stop smoking, over time the cilia will actually grow back. But for you and for me, for a healthy trachea, you've got cilia that are beating and pushing stuff up and out all the time without you even thinking about it. The other one is a flagella. Flagella is like a tail on a cell. And so this would be on a cell that needs to be highly mobile. Sperm is our best example. Sperm kind of looks like a tadpole, right? It's got this long flagellum on it. We used to think that the flagellum went back and forth to allow the sperm to swim. We found that it actually is like in a corkscrew pattern, whipping around and around and around. And so it propels the sperm forward really, really rapidly, which is a good thing since the whole point of a sperm is delivery of genetic material. Okay, so that is your plasma membrane in a nutshell, including junctions and some specialized parts. Let me know if you have any